Welcome to TSN Inside Sports. I'm Dave Hodge. The Jets may or may not have played their last game in Winnipeg. The Save the Jets campaign continues to dominate the news out of the Manitoba capital, and it remains to be seen if the sale in principle and transfer of the team to Minneapolis will occur. If it doesn't, it will be due to an outpouring of civic, provincial, and national sentiment and money that supports the belief that Canada must hold on to what it's got in the NHL. There is also the belief that those outside of Canada, perhaps even those inside the NHL headquarters in New York City, don't really care how healthy the league is in this country as long as it is healthy wherever it might be doing business. And as the Nordiques play in New York tonight, there is considerable opinion that says it might be their last game as a team based in Quebec City. Some of the issues are different in Quebec, but basically it is the same story as Winnipeg. Is the NHL being de-Canadianized? If so, is it on purpose? And if so, to what effect? These questions are examined in this edition of the documentary series For the Love of the Game. In this case, we might also be asking, whose game is it anyway?
You know, back in the 6-team league, we only had 2 Canadian teams, and nobody worried that there was too many American teams, and there was 4 teams in the United States, and there was only 2 in Canada. You never heard talk of that. And so it's silly talk. To be honest with you, I really don't acknowledge it because it's a Canadian sport, and it always will be.
The game, the NHL game, has been American in many respects for a long time.
We would like to have 8 healthy, stable franchises in Canada. We've got 6. I'm worried about the other 2.
Canada is no longer welcome within the NHL.
We want to keep our team in Winnipeg, not in the United States of America.
For more than a century, we have played a game that has grown to become one of this nation's most treasured assets. But as we move into the next century, the fear of losing our game is both daunting and disturbing. While Canada may always remain the soul of hockey, the game is being bought by American big money and major markets. In this, For the Love of the Game, we'll investigate the changing face of the game of hockey. We'll travel to the NHL offices in New York City and talk with the league's commissioner, Gary Bettman, a man some say is leading the game southward.
It's not a country-by-country issue. It is really a market-by-market. Fans in their own market root for their own teams. If there aren't enough fans in a market to support a team, if there isn't the appropriate facilities for a team, then that market isn't going to have a team.
In Toronto, a professor who is an astute observer of the history of hockey poses the question, who really benefits by keeping the game alive in Canada?
The league as a whole is enjoying monopoly profits. And much of that comes from public subsidy in Canada and communities like Winnipeg.
And finally, we'll return to a small town in the prairies where amateur hockey perhaps best captures the true soul of our game.
You know, hockey's first on the list, and I think everybody follows it, and everybody loves the game. I think it's just part of the heritage.
Hockey was a game that for many years Canadians could proudly claim their own. Even though there were only 2 Canadian franchises in the old 6-team era, the players who staffed the NHL rosters most often were Canadian. In fact, up until 1967, over 96% of NHL players were Canadian-born. But the face of hockey has undergone a cultural facelift. Today, Canadians make up only 62% of NHL rosters. The question of when we started to lose a grip on the game in recent history began with a meeting of two nations who considered themselves to be the superpowers of the game. The 1972 Canada-Russia series was the first time that Canada's hockey supremacy would be challenged. Each contest took on epic proportions. It became more than a game. It stretched into political territory. It was the free world against the communist states played out within the confines of a hockey arena. Of course, if Canada won, it would prove we had the better hockey system. We played on emotional raw talent against the robotic tic-tac-toe of the Russian attack and came away victorious. But it was close enough that in retrospect, as a hockey nation, we would begin to question our dominance of the game and our premier position beyond our borders. Years later, when the walls of communism fell, the gush of European and Soviet players fleeing for jobs in the NHL forever changed the cultural makeup of the league. While the post-war baby boom generation grew up emulating Canadian-bred players like Rocket Richard or Bobby Hull, today's hockey heroes, more often than not, originate from foreign soil. And some of the most dominant players in the NHL today are not Canadian, but American. And while these facts alone don't answer the question, whose game is it? They are just part of the sum of the whole, more pieces of the puzzle of where are we headed? The growth of the NHL, when looked at in terms of U.S.-Canadian parity, shows at a very early start that hockey's future lay in the United States, not in Canada. In 1967, when the NHL first expanded, adding 6 teams, all were American-based franchises. And throughout expansion history, the chasm between American-based and Canadian-based teams continues to widen. By the end of the regular season, of the 26 NHL franchises, 18 are American. And in all likelihood, by the start of the next season, 1 and possibly more franchises will be added to that figure. NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman has often been targeted as the man behind the proposed moves of Canadian franchises southward. At a time when the NHL is in a state of constant flux, keeping Canada's franchises in place is a challenge given the economic pressures of doing business in small market cities.
We recognize the importance to the emotional well-being and psychological benefits of having a professional sports franchise, of having a hockey team, particularly in Canada, where maybe the only professional team in town. And so that's something we take very seriously. But again, if the economics of a community make it impossible for a franchise to survive because they can't get a new building, by way of example, then you have to question the long-term growth, because you want to have a team that's competitive. You want to have a team that each year gives its fans the hope that always springs eternal, that maybe this will be the year they win the cup. But if the local forces, the business community, the advertising community, the local government in terms of a building, and the fans showing up to watch the games in person, if that isn't all there, then you have to question how much effort long-term goes into keeping that franchise there.
Cash-strapped and in dire need of a new facility, the Winnipeg Jets' legacy has come to epitomize the struggles of a small market franchise.
In the absence of a new building, then those cities are making statements in effect that they don't want to be major league professional cities as it relates to sports franchises. That's a fair decision for them to make if they don't want to make the investment, but that may carry consequences with it. That has nothing to do with us grabbing the franchises to the United States. That simply says if you're not going to give them an adequate home to live in, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, but we're trying everything we can.
As the Jets story moved out of the sports section and onto the front pages, Bettman predicted the NHL would be portrayed as a villain. But in a game that is spilled out onto the streets, there are no villains, no heroes, just casualties.
Certainly was not the partnership we understood. Greed is a word that comes to mind. You know, where is the understanding of what the sport is about? Where is the understanding of the fans? The reaction that came to me, too, was, well, then Canada is no longer welcome within the NHL.